Well, hello everyone. I always look forward to our Q&A time on Fridays, questions and answers. And today I had one come through, and I'm going to add it to another one that came through this week and see if I can blend them together. First of all, some of you asked a question and I'd like to clarify it. If you look behind me, you will see flowers. My wife does the flowers for the chapel every day or every other day. So she is always making up flowers so that when I celebrate Mass in here, God is glorified and you have something that you can look at. And so I'm really grateful for her doing that. And then somebody said, but on Sundays, where you are on Sundays, it's a place called St. Timothy's, what if we wanted to have flowers put up there? Could we do it? And the answer is of course. All you have to do is just send us an email and say, I'd like very much to have flowers at St. Timothy's at the high altar or at the Mary Shrine or something like that, and I'd like to be able to say it's in memory of someone or it's in thanksgiving for someone. It's whatever you want. If that's something you want to participate in, you're more than welcome to do it. Well, let's get to the main question at hand. What's this book you're writing? Well, as some of you have probably noticed, and I'm not advocating you do this, I've done a lot of writing over the years. And sometimes people say, why don't you take all of those things that you've taught at the various places and the lectures you've given and the things that we see on YouTube that you've done at various places around the world, why don't you put them all into a book? Well, that's kind of a burden for me, to be honest. I mean, it really is. If somebody wants them, they're welcome to have them. And I usually say to people, if you find them, you're more than welcome to use them. However, there is another issue, and that's the issue of something that we call the parish press. And by now, I think most of you have figured out that my wife and I own something called the parish press. It's a publication company. We, in fact, bought it because it was for sale, and it was the only publication company that actually had a number of the marvelous devotional items that were used by so many of our people during almost all of the 1900s and now into 2000s. So it's a very old publication company. And it's very Anglican, although not all of our customers are Anglicans. Now, when I say Anglican, somebody the other day said, I'm not an Anglican, I'm an Episcopalian. I need to clarify that for you. We've always, if you were an Episcopalian or are an Episcopalian, we were always Anglicans. What I mean is you go around the world and you say something like, I'm an Episcopalian, and somebody would probably look at you and say, I don't have a clue as to what that is. But if you said I'm an Anglican, they'd, oh yeah, I get it. Really, the United States was the only place that ever called the branch of Anglicanism, it was here, Episcopalian. Now, that changed a little bit later because the church in Scotland called itself the Episcopal Church, but that's because it wanted to distinguish itself from the official Church of Scotland, which is actually Presbyterian and doesn't have bishops. So all the word Episcopal means is Church of Bishops. But there are the three largest communions, that is the worldwide manifestations of Christianity, are first of all the Roman communion. Now, somebody will object and they'll say, oh, but that means Catholic, right? I mean, if you're a Roman Catholic, that might be what you'd say. And I get that, but the second largest communion in the world, which is the Orthodox communion, uses the term Catholic to describe itself too, because of the fact that the word Catholic means universal. Now, when you say Roman Catholic, then that means that everybody in the largest communion who is under the authority of the Church of Rome. And that includes a lot of other rites and usages, by the way, that might be of surprise to you. For example, if you went to a church called Maronite Rite, It's under the Pope, but there's nothing going on inside that church liturgically that would lead you to believe that because of the style. It's very much a Lebanese manifestation. Or if you went to a Byzantine Catholic church, it's under the Pope. But really, its worship is much, much more like you would see in a, let's say, a Russian Orthodox church, because some of the people are Ruthenians in both. And so when you look at the second largest, the Orthodox communion, you're referring to Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, all of the Orthodox Church in the various nations, many of which are in the United States, largely because those various ethnic groups moved to the United States. So, for example, if you were in Russia right now, you wouldn't expect to go up to somebody and say, "Excuse me, I'm looking for the Syrian Orthodox Church here." Or if you were in Greece, you wouldn't say, "Could you tell me where the Russian Orthodox Church is?" Well, in this country, if you ask for the Orthodox Church, you have to define it. What kind of Orthodox Church are you looking for? Likewise, if you're in the largest communion, the Roman Catholic Church, you have to be able to tell people which rite you're looking for, or when you walk inside the door, you may look around and say, doesn't look like nor sound like what I'm used to, and that may be true. And it used to be said about the third largest communion in the church, called the Anglican Communion, that it was pretty much similar. English, Book of Common Prayer, you could pretty much discover the same thing wherever you went around the world, but that's not the case anymore. And that's as Anglicanism has continued to go into other parts of the world, it's taken on the distinctive character of the area where it is, in terms of language, in terms of vestments, and now different books of common prayer for each one of those provinces, instead of having one book of common prayer from the Church of England that is used or even translated into local language. So in the United States, originally the third largest communion, the Anglican Communion, was present here, but it was the Church of England in the colonies. Eventually, when the split occurred between England and the colonies, and we had the United States, anybody who was an Anglican was suspect. So the name of the church was changed to Episcopal Church, or the Church of Bishops. So when you refer to yourself, if you are an Anglican, when you say the word Anglican, you're referring to your identity worldwide and your participation in the third largest communion that exists in Christendom. I hope that helps a little bit. It's not like somebody saying, "I used to be an Episcopalian, now I'm an Anglican." Well, if you were an Episcopalian, you've always been an Anglican. But if you've been an Anglican, it doesn't mean you were always an Episcopalian. It's like when somebody, as I experienced regularly, would move from the West Indies or from Africa, they didn't have a clue what an Episcopal church was. So even decades ago, I had to put the name Anglican on the church so that the West Indians and the Africans, and some of the English actually, would not look around and say, guess we don't exist in this country. So what's that have to do with anything? Well, it has to do with the fact that the parish press is for everybody. There are people in the Roman Catholic Church, especially those who call themselves the Ordinariate. They're called the Ordinariate. They're set up, they use very much what most Anglicans would be familiar with, but they are under the Pope. And then certainly Orthodox, there's an expression of Orthodoxy called Western Rite. I'm not going to go into detail, but they're wonderful folks. But their liturgy is pretty much what Book of Common Prayer is like, for the most part. And so they're very interested in the things that are published by the parish press. And then Anglicans of every stripe likewise are interested. You see the Mass cards on the altar? We publish those. Do you remember those things that show people how to put on vestments, or how to set up the chalice and the paten, and all those things? That's one of the things we do. Go and look at it at the parish press. But one of the books that we decided that we wanted to publish was not even in book form. It was in rough form, and it was typed up in a notebook, a little 3-ring notebook about this big, on a mechanical typewriter by a priest who was very well known in those days by the name of Father Homer Rogers. He's been dead a while, and he's not as well known today, I'm sorry to say, but we're trying to keep him known among people outside the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where he had served a great deal of his ministry. And so you're familiar with the book that we use on Saturdays called Bedtime Stories for Children by Father Homer Rogers. Well, last week, Betty and I reached a whole new point. There were 25 chapters in that book, and we finished it. We've done all 25 chapters. And the last chapter last week was all about David and Goliath. And you and I know that there was a great deal more that happened after David and Goliath. And honestly, I just didn't want to leave with little children the image of David holding the hair of Goliath and not having anything under it other than a head, holding the bodiless head of Goliath. Didn't seem like where we wanted to leave children. So what I've done is I prayed and looked very carefully at everything that Father Homer Rogers has written. And while I can certainly not write just like him, because he had a very unique style, and certainly the way in which he was able to communicate what was going on in the Old Testament caught the imagination of many children. And most of you, I'm sure, have already bought the book and given it to your children, your grandchildren, your godchildren, and so on. And we get a lot of sweet notes from people telling us how much they enjoy it. Well, as you know, a lot happened to King David. In fact, let's put it this way. A lot happened to the shepherd David after he killed Goliath. Some of it involved King Saul, who was the king of Israel. Some of it involved King Saul's son named Jonathan, who was David's best friend. They became best buddies. Or as I write for kids in chapter 1, they were BFFs. Kids use that kind of conversation, by the way, of words. And then, of course, it involves things happening with Saul, where he gets rather jealous of David, and where Jonathan tries to help David out so that his dad, King Saul, doesn't kill David. And then we get to the point later on where David is old enough that it's time for him to get married, and so he marries Saul's daughter, Michal, or as we say usually Michael. It would be probably Michelle if we were making it very contemporary. But not everything actually worked out for them, did it? Because you may recall that Saul is always out to battle. He has David out there doing battle for him, but then all of a sudden we have Saul attacking David, and David's trying to escape. And at various points, David runs up to King Saul and he says things like, "Wow, I sure don't know what I did to upset you this much, but please let me know. And do please keep in mind that your son is my best friend, and I'm your son-in-law, for goodness sake." So how does that work out for them? So I dig into the personalities of King Saul and in the personalities of King David, and then take us all the way through the death of Saul, and then see what happens to David after the death of Saul, what happens with David as it relates to that difficulty with Bathsheba. Now, there's a couple things in there that aren't easy to explain for children, and so I've had to work with some delicacy here. For example, when I go back and look at the Hebrew on some of them, some of the sections there, it's clear that the Hebrew is what you might call very earthy. So when it's describing what human beings do by themselves or with other human beings, it doesn't use polite language in Hebrew. But the King James Version of the Bible, for example, which is really the authorized version, King James Version is just its nickname, uses very polite language, and it uses words that perhaps don't give the same visual image. I'll give you two of them that I had to gingerly work with in the chapters that I've written. I've written 7 chapters thus far, 6 completely, and the 7th, God willing, I'll finish today. And at this point, I'm looking at writing at least 25 chapters that will get us through the Old Testament. Then I'm going to do approximately 10 chapters on the Apocrypha, or what we call the Deuterocanonical books. And then I'm going to begin another book which will be on the New Testament. And all of it will be designed to teach children those things which adults understand, but it will allow adults to be able to read it to the children and even fill in the blanks a little bit. If you've ever purchased our instruction booklet for First Holy Communion class, or for baptisms, or for confirmation, it's that same idea that you discovered in the books that we've written. In the books we've written for children, for First Holy Communion, for baptism if they're a little bit older than babes in arms, and for confirmation, you will notice in there that we give a little leeway for adults to jump in and give their own stories. So that, for example, if you're teaching a confirmation class for children, it has all the information in there that you need to teach, and it gives you narratives, but then it gives a break and it says, now at this point go and do a church tour and write down everything you saw, and then you sit down with your teacher and the teacher will tell you a little bit more. Or at the very end, instead of having a quiz where it's all right or all wrong, we've put in a crossword puzzle. So at the end of it, young people get to do a crossword puzzle based on the answers that they have for the questions that are being asked. And so it's an attempt to be able to make those things which some people remember not as fondly a little more enjoyable. For example, I still have my confirmation book from when I was 12 years old, and memorizing the catechism, while it's still fun for me to recall, today doesn't work in quite the same way because of the media that we deal with today. And let's face it, that's plain vanilla black and white, and what the kids today expect is glitz and glamour. So that's the reason we write the books the way we do for children today, including this book, which will have some modern phrases in it, and I think it'll be a little bit of fun. But here's the two that I'm having a little trouble with initially. When King Saul was on his journey, I want you to just work with me a little bit. If you had just had breakfast, and you had had a few cups of coffee, for example, and then you got on your horse and you started galloping and going somewhere, is it possible that you would need to stop to do something personal? Yeah. Well, King Saul needed to do that, and he found a cave to do it in. The Hebrew's pretty clear about what he was doing. So let me tell you what I opted for as I looked at the Hebrew and looked at the English text. I said that King Saul had to go to the bathroom, so he went into a cave. That image works for children. So it plays a little bit with the Hebrew, but it catches the idea. The other one that I had to work a little bit with, especially going back and looking into the Hebrew, is that here we have King David at his palace, and he's looking out at another building, and he sees out on the roof a beautiful woman named Bathsheba, and that night he decides that he wants to invite her in to look at his baseball card collection. No, I didn't write that. I'm just giving you what you've probably already figured out, right? Yeah. How do I explain that one? Well, you'll have to find out. I really worked that one through so that I don't scandalize a poor little child who's saying, what does that mean? Or some adult reads and says, oh no, am I going to have to explain that to my grandchild or my child. No, don't worry, folks. I've written it in a way that kind of moves it over. The other one that I've had to work a little bit with is, you remember when King Solomon became king and he had asked God for wisdom, because God said he would give King Solomon anything that he asked for, and King Solomon asked for wisdom. It was a beautiful gift. And the first test case came, as you may remember, when two prostitutes showed up at his door, stating that they both lived in the same house. You catch that drift, don't you? And that they'd each had babies, 3 days apart, in fact, and that, as the explanation goes, one of the mothers fell asleep on top of her baby, and the baby died of suffocation. And so then you may remember that the one mother wakes up, finds her baby is dead because she fell asleep on top of her baby. She goes over to the other mother as her baby and steals her baby and claims it as her own. And then they both show up to King Solomon to say something opposite of each other. My baby, no, it's not. My baby's alive, no, your baby's dead. On and on, back and forth they go. King Solomon has to figure that one out. Do you remember how that worked out? I think you do. And that's where King Solomon says to one of his servants, bring me a sword. Remember what happens next? He says, okay, here's my sword, here's the live baby. I'm going to cut the baby in half, and you can have one half, and you can have one half. And you remember what happens next, don't you? That the real mommy says, no, please don't do that. Just give my baby over to that woman. I don't want my baby to be dead. And the other woman says, now, that is a really good idea. Then neither one of us can have a child. And Solomon says, well, I just found out who the real mommy is, didn't I? Okay, think about that for a moment. How do you explain that to a 6-year-old, for example, a 5, 6, 7-year-old, without it sounding so bizarre? Well, I've been working with a number of things like that, so pray for me. But I think this book ought to be finished in the next couple months, and it'll be ready to be published, and then we'll keep you posted on that. But in the process, I'll leave you a few thoughts about this book. It's been intriguing to me to dig inside the mind of King Saul and to see what it's like when paranoia and jealousy overtake a human being and they lose all sense of rationality and morality. The other thing that's really helped me is to look inside David and to realize what a flawed human being he was and how many sins he'd committed. Well, think about that for a moment. Why would anybody want to have a king like David who stole a man's wife, Uriah, put Uriah out in the front line of the army so that he could get killed right away so that David could take his widow? I mean, that really did not please God very much. Why would anybody have anything to do with King David, considering all the nasty things that he did and the number of times that he was in trouble with God? Well, that's because God doesn't use perfect human beings for his plan. He uses flawed human beings because that's all he has to work with. So does that mean because King David said bad things and did bad things that we should never pay any attention to the 150 Psalms that he wrote? I don't think so. So it was a good lesson for me once again to realize that we're all broken, we're all flawed, we all say things that we wish we hadn't, we all have done things that we wish we hadn't done. If we had an opportunity to do them all over again, we might have done them differently. But God can still use us. And it'll start making more sense to people later on when I get into the New Testament and I explain to children. Remember how important it was to have the city of David and where the city of David was? And do all of you know that what happened right up front here in the New Testament is that St. Joseph and St. Mary had to travel to the city of David because it was census year. So I'll be able to tie it in right away with children reading it, because right now they're knowing a little bit more about the census. And then they'll find out a little bit more about what the city of David is all about. And then it'll give me a chance to tell them more about Bethlehem and talk with them about several things that took place in Bethlehem, right? You remember some of them, don't you? Yeah. How about Rachel's tomb? Do you remember that one? Remember how much Joseph loved Rachel? All those things. Your children, if they've been following these chapters, are already up to knowing that part of Bethlehem. And then I'll be able to take them further with the census that took place when Mary and Joseph had to go there. And on and take it. And I even have a chance to stick in a few things about what can be seen. Example, if you go to the Holy Land today, and you know I've been privileged to be there quite a bit, down in the Kidron Valley, very close to where the palace of King David would have been, is what's called the tomb of Absalom. And you may remember that David loved his son Absalom very much, but his son Absalom betrayed him and set up his own army and even started calling himself king. And David still loved his son. Well, there's a monument there. It's not the original one, because the Old Testament, 1 Samuel, says that that tomb is there to this day. Well, that's not really the case now. That is, during the time that 1 Samuel was presented to everybody way back then, it was true that they could say, yeah, I know where that is. Well, today there is another monument there. That monument, by the way, is all nicked up with all sorts of things, from part of it from one of the wars, a little bit from the 40s, a little bit from the 67, but where the bullets have hit the tomb of Absalom. But a lot of those markings on that tomb are from parents who take their children there and start yelling about Absalom, throwing stones there, and then turning to the children and say, you want to know what happened to the bad son of King David? Let me tell you the story. And so apparently that's supposed to, encourage young children not to do something bad, because they get to see this tomb of Absalom and hear the story. I'm going to be able to work in a little bit too about the word Gehenna. Do you remember the word Gehenna? Well, Gehenna is oftentimes used synonymously with hell, but it's in the New Testament. If we dig underneath it, it's because there was a place called Gehenna, which is just over the wall from approximately where the temple was. I can't say it exactly, because all the walls have been rebuilt and placed in different spots, but there was an eternal inferno. It was a garbage dump, so people went over, they dumped their garbage there, and if you keep dumping your garbage there and the flames keep going, I think you know that the use of incense was a very welcome thing to have in the walled city, because you could smell the stench of Gehenna all the time. So one of the ways that people could explain what hell was like, they'd say, well, hell's just like Gehenna, that garbage dump that's always burning. So I'm going to get underneath that and explain that to children without giving it the lengthy explanation that I gave to you. But my goal is that children will get to know the Bible so well that a number of things that are happening in the world today will make more sense to them by virtue of what God talks about, what he shows us in the Old Testament, in the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. Anyway, that's what I'm working on, and I'm hoping you're praying for me, because I could use it. And if you want a copy of that book, well, just talk to my dear wife every day. She is reformatting and putting it in correct order, because she knows how to do that end of the operation. There would be no book called To God Be the Glory that we wrote together years ago were not for her foresight, insight, creativity, and pinning me down for a few more chapters to write. So pray for both of us as we continue to do what we believe God is asking us to do in this time in our lives and hopefully in your lives. So God bless you. Thanks for your excellent questions, and keep on sending them on. And just remember how special all of you are, and don't allow everything going on in the world today to drag you down. Remember, keep your eyes on Jesus. God bless.